sex and power, sex and power.
Welcome to the Sex and Power Podcast, real talk at the intersections of sex, power, oppression, and liberation. I'm your host, Janice Selby. Joining me today is Mike Steve Collins, who teaches at Texas A&M University. Our conversation today will focus on his recent book, The Anti-Civil Rights Movement, Affirmative Action as Wedge and Weapon, where Mike examines how policies created to promote opportunity and fairness were slowly reshaped into tools that divided the very groups they were meant to empower. In addition to the anti-civil rights movement, Mike Collins has also authored Understanding Etheridge Knight and The Traveling Queen, as well as many essays and poems. I'm indebted to documentarian Mick Larson for introducing me to Mike's work. And Mike's TikTok content is also very thought-provoking on topics like the politics of envy and the religion of money. Welcome, Mike Steve Collins.
Thanks for having me. I very much appreciate your invitation, and many thanks to Mick for introducing us.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. And you and I were just chatting a little bit before we got started, and I let you know that I'm broadcasting from Canada, from the unceded territory of Syilx Okanagan people, and you're joining me from the United States right now. And so some folks that are tuning in might not have a lot of knowledge or information about our topic today. So I'm going to be reading my questions that I have written down. And I know sometimes you'll be referring to your own notes as well, because there's a lot of good, important information. We don't want to miss any out.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. The first question I have, it's pretty basic in here. What is the anti-civil rights movement? So you might first have to tell us a little bit about the civil rights movement then, for those who aren't familiar.
Okay, so the civil rights movement is a movement led by people who are very well known in history, like Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King led a series of rights for African Americans to try to end the practice of segregation of African Americans, to open up opportunities in terms of hiring for African Americans, and not only them, but also but for people across the board. Like towards the end of just before, on the eve of his assassination, more or less, he was leading a poor people's campaign, which in a way you could hear echoes of it in even people like Bernie Sanders today. And so that's the civil rights movement. But before Martin Luther King, there's a legal wing of the civil rights movement led by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and they had an NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And the most prominent lawyer and the head of the defense fund in the 50s was Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall led a tremendous victory in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, which ended the practice or declared unconstitutional the practice of segregated schools, and basically started the ball rolling towards an integrated society. So those two wings, the Martin Luther King wing, the Thurgood Marshall wing, you could, in a nutshell, they're the wings of the civil rights movement. And it culminated in 1964, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which transformed the country legally in lots of ways, which we may be able to touch on as we go on. But every great movement provokes a backlash, and the 1954 decision provoked a tremendous backlash and counter-organizing effort that I call the anti-civil rights movement. And for instance, there was like massive resistance, a campaign of massive resistance to complying with Brown versus Board in the South. And this included pulling like white kids out of public schools, opening up private schools that were sometimes funded by the government. And so there was, and one of the things was like, one of the quotations in this documentary, Eyes on the Prize, is one of the authors says, my little girl, or one of the the white protesters said, "My little girls are going to be sitting next to some black person, black," and so that's why there was this massive resistance. And so this, although it might seem like this wave of anger, it got institutionalized gradually. Like there were people in the Senate and in the Congress, like Strom Thurmond, who were like firm segregationists, who issued this thing called the Southern Manifesto, which was going to try to organize legal and other resistance because they said the Supreme Court decision was unconstitutional and it was an assault upon the South and so on. And anyway, over time, this like naked support for segregation, I don't know if you say maybe modulated, that's the word, that's the only word I can think of at the moment. It modulated into like this very kind of obsessive promotion of colorblindness. So in other words, although Martin Luther King said, and this is the quote that conservatives love to repeat, he said, we want to be judged by the content of our character, not by the color of our skin. The people who like were kind of going to use colorblindness against the civil rights movement said, well, okay, if that's the case, then we can't have any recognition of any racial difference. And therefore, even though in this school on this side of let's say this on this side of the tracks, there's a school that's very well funded, has AP classes and so on. We can't make a distinction between that school and the experience of the students there and the school on the other side of the tracks that doesn't have up-to-date books and so on. And so when there were efforts to integrate, like get Black students into the richer school, like one of the most controversial efforts was busing. There was massive anger and resistance to that. And so it's a long story, as you can tell. But basically, in a nutshell, in my book, I trace how this the anti-civil rights movement got institutionalized in think tanks. It got institutionalized in political action committees. It got institutionalized in this class of intellectuals who, in a way, are triumphing now. Like a lot of the things that are happening in the United States now, they didn't just come out of nowhere. They were like kind of incubated over the years in think tanks and like in this whole kind of class of intellectuals who over the decades have formulated ideas that are now being put into practice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it seems just so crazy to me. It's so Dr. King or Reverend King, he really was pretty much aligned with a lot of Jesus's teaching. And then we had the moral majority came along, and Jerry Falwell and those people who also claim to be inspired by Jesus and following Jesus, doing the exact opposite, being the ones that say, I refuse to let my children attend school with children of color. It just is, it's mind-blowing to me. And to look at where the United States is today, and I'm watching it from Canada, and I know Canada also has our own terrible problems with racism too, but it's shocking to me. And as you're saying, the roots go far, far back. So thanks for that about the anti-civil rights movement. My next question, I wondered, what are some of the most striking or surprising tactics that you uncovered about how conservative legal and political networks leveraged affirmative action to split coalitions, and what lessons do they offer for coalition building today? So when we talk about affirmative action there, just give us a little synopsis. What do I mean when I say affirmative action?
Okay, affirmative action has evolved over the years. It initially emerged out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to try to open up opportunity to Black people who were not getting job opportunities in many areas. And President Lyndon Johnson issued an executive order to try to, again, ensure compliance by firms that did business with the government. That, you need to take affirmative steps to diversify your workforce, or your government funding will be threatened. Of course, that's all being turned on its head now. And so over time it evolved. At first they said, well, you need to advertise that you welcome diverse applicants for the jobs that you have available. But then this guy, Edward Sylvester, who was a kind of bureaucrat, although that has a negative connotation, but in this case, he came up with a very smart idea. He said, actually, even before Lyndon Johnson, I should say, JFK had instituted some efforts to encourage companies to practice affirmative action. But Sylvester found that you could encourage all you want. It didn't really make that much difference in terms of the amount of hiring. So he wanted to put more teeth into it. And so that's where things like the Lyndon Johnson executive order came into play and the way it was administered. And so this also started to happen in universities, partly in response to the riots of the 1960s. There are some people say uprisings instead of riots, because people realized that there was this lack of opportunity and poverty in the Black community that was creating a volatile situation. And they thought, well, we need to, the current commission report said we need to open opportunity. And they use the term Black men, get them better educated, better job opportunities. And so people like Sylvester started using affirmative action to get companies to get on board. And so universities also started to get on board too. But in the 70s, this man named Alan Bakke applied to the University of California, Davis Medical School, and he was rejected. And he was an engineer who had served in Vietnam, and he was very upset that he was not admitted. And he automatically assumed that it was because a minority had been admitted in his place, although that's a fallacy that maybe we can explain as we go along. Anyway, his case got national attention, and so this is how affirmative action came under attack and started. Part of the way it became under attack and started being described as reverse discrimination. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You look like you wanted to say something.
No, I'm just agreeing. You're connecting the dots for me that it's making sense. Then how it's come to be almost weaponized then, when it started out as something that was very necessary and positive and helpful.
Right. And so the Bakke decision, though, it did save affirmative action, because the person who wrote the controlling opinion, Lewis Powell, said, okay, you can't use affirmative action to remedy past discrimination, but you can consider diversity to be a plus. That if somebody comes from a different background, say into a university, they bring a different perspective, which can have educational benefits. And so he said you can consider a kind of quantum of diversity as a plus that an applicant brings, and so you can include that in your decision about whether to admit the applicant or not. And so affirmative action survived as a kind of edge, at least I'm talking about in universities now, that people could bring. But then, of course, there's an attack on diversity that led some of the people in the anti-affirmative action movement started to formulate, and that eventually led to the striking down of affirmative action in university admissions.
It's so hard for me to understand how people could twist. I mean, how could diversity be considered a bad thing? Equity, inclusion, these are things that make society better. We do better when we collaborate. And this is exactly what it feels like the largely white billionaires are trying to turn on its head. Do you, I'm sorry, this is not one of the questions that I included, but did you feel like you saw this coming, like you saw things moving in this direction as you kind of tracked it all along? Or has it been as surprising to you, this whole outcry against DEI, and DEI is a terrible thing, all those things they're saying? Is it shocking to you, or really not so shocking because it's the way the wind was blowing?
Well, it's the way the wind was blowing. And when I was doing my research, like a lot of these people that you see in the news, like, or organizations that you see in the news, like the Heritage Foundation, I already like had lots of experience of like reading their ideas as I was doing the research for the book. But the speed it's surprising. Like, it's been less than a year, and there's been like so much destruction. I mean, not of a lot of things, but especially of the affirmative action infrastructure, which was built up over decades and which was kind of vetted in court cases, like even the Baca case, and which, seemed to be, well, it was shaky because there was this very successful litigator named Edward Bloom who organized a number of cases that struck tremendous blows to affirmative action, which still survived until 2023, and also to the Voting Rights Act. Because he thought that drawing districts that would be majority minorities, so that minorities would have equal access to that. I mean, the justification was minorities would have equal access to the political process. He saw it as just strictly racial discrimination, and he wanted to eliminate that. His goal is to eliminate all consideration of race. And so he was like going along at a pretty steady pace, but it'd still take him a couple of years to knock down another element of, what he would consider like affirmative action, voting rights, or affirmative action in education or employment too. But with Trump in office, it's gone at just like lightning speed. That's kind of surprised me. And it turns out that for the 4 years that he was not in office, like all the people around him were just plotting. Well, like maybe I should try to use a more scholarly word. They were planning to
scheming. They were scheming.
Okay. And there's this massive, which you might have heard of, this Project 2025 document, like a couple thousand pages, and it goes through chapter and verse of basically laying out almost everything that's being done now. So there's like a very careful plan, and that's the Heritage Foundation. And that's another part of what I explore in my book, the way these kind of foundations are built up with tremendous donations from conservative, wealthy conservatives. And it's not only Heritage, but there's a Manhattan Institute. Then there are legal public interest law firms that are all get this like kind of this river of funding that allows them to bring cases and to make these kind of comprehensive plans that then when a politician wins, and Trump, $200 million from Elon Musk alone, his first term, he got a tremendous amount of financial support from another conservative billionaire. And so that's why I'm saying it's like anti-civil rights movement, because it's not just Trump over here, it's Trump like supported by this massive network that coordinates money, ideas, and people.
Right. And oppression. And the ideas seem to focus on oppressing people of color and the queer community and women. So making me think that the only ones who are designed to prosper under this will be white males, and particularly white Christian national males. It's concerning. I mean, as a woman, I see it as concerning, and I don't even live in your country. So it's a lot of oppression and very coordinated, as you say.
Yeah. Although I have to say that if you brought any of these leaders in, they would say, no, we're not oppressing anybody. We are championing merit. We are championing color blindness, where like you don't see the difference, or you don't treat people differently in any way. And so in fact, when I interviewed Edward Bloom, who is the architect of the case, the Supreme Court case, and several others, and the Voting Rights Act case that so damaged, from my point, damaged triumphs of the civil rights movement. When I interviewed him, he said, my role model is an NAACP legal defense fund, because he said, in the 50s, and he said, I supported like a case like Brown versus the Board of Education, but I think the civil rights movement has gone astray and has become too obsessed. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's become too obsessed with race, and so I want to bring it back to its first principles. And so, if you bring one of these people into the room, they're going to say, "We're not oppressing. We're not in favor of oppressing. We're in favor of removing oppression."
Wow. Oh, that seems so. Like not slimy, but it's slick. It seems almost like a slick maneuver. And when you use the phrase colorblind, I'm remembering back to maybe 10 years ago when I said at one point, and I can't remember if it was on social media or what it was, but I proudly declared myself colorblind. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that, when I had the pleasure of speaking with an Indigenous woman in Canada, and she gently and kindly let me know that when I used that term, when I, described myself as colorblind, I don't see people in color, I only see people as human, that she felt that essentially was ignoring all of the strife, all of the trauma, all of the things that her group, and so every other group of color went through to even get to where they are today. And that was I was so grateful to her for letting me know that, because here I thought I was being virtuous and I just didn't realize. So I'm grateful to you also for talking about this, this one phrase that a lot of white people can tend to use without really thinking of the damage that it can inflict.
Yeah, well, I think colorblindness is great as a goal, but it's not great as a declared reality. And I think that's what somebody like Bloom is doing. He's saying the only thing standing in the way of equality is acknowledgement of racial difference. And that's, as you just pointed out, that's like very ahistorical. It's a historical way of looking at things. It reduces people to these like two dimensions where like the history they come out of doesn't matter, because it's kind of declared solved. It's a problem that has been solved. And so why are you still thinking about it?
Wow, that it's such a powerful point. I'm wondering about factors or historical inflection points that you see as pivotal in shifting the momentum away from inclusion toward rollback. So there have been some that have been quite recent since the most recent Trump administration, and then there were some kind of going farther back. Are there any, kind of the top three or whatever that stand out to you?
Top three, I mentioned like the Bloom's court cases have been, because like I said, like he went after the Voting Rights Act, this Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which still exists, but he was able to kind of get Section 4 invalidated by the Supreme Court. And this means that like states that were required pre-clearance before they could change their voting laws, pre-clearance by the federal government, were kind of, they no longer had to seek pre-clearance. And so after that case, Shelby County versus Holder, what happened is like some states were literally targeted Black voters for kind of reduced representation. And because they didn't have to be pre-clear their laws anymore, their voting laws. And so they were able to kind of go wild. And so that's the kind of Bloom campaign is one. Another one, very important, is conservative media. because conservative media prepares the ground for making this kind of ahistorical view of the country seem the only acceptable one, and it clears the ground for making any raising of issues of like, well, there might still be racial discrimination, or there might be some need to consider race as a way of leveling the playing field. It makes anything like that seem to be an assault on the basic principles of the United States. And so conservative media is very important. And I talk about in the book how Fox News was founded by Rupert Murdoch, and he hired this guy Roger Ailes, and Roger Ailes said to him when they were talking about founding Fox, he said, Rupert Murdoch asked him, how much do you think it'll cost? And he says something like 900 million or something like that. He says he could lose it all. And Murdoch said, go ahead, because, he's this multinational media magnate. And so once that rose, once Fox News became like, it's now the most popular cable network in America, or the most widely viewed. And so they're able to just like shape basically national perception. And so that's number two. And then you have like these kind of, whatever else you want to say about Trump, the guy is very charismatic. And so you have somebody like that, I don't know what you think, but just like objectively, you look at what he's been able to do. He's very charismatic. You have like you have this potent political force. You have this kind of media powerhouse shaping the narrative. And then on the legal front, you have somebody who's just like really so persistent and also very well funded. He's another, Bloom's campaign is very well funded by a conservative network.
Right. And then when we also factor in, it seems like our attention span has just become shorter and shorter with the advent, especially of social media. And people are less willing to do the research. And then potentially with some older generations, and even I would say mine, I'm in my 50s, we want what the media tells us to be true. So in the 70s and 80s, I certainly grew up believing that what the newspapers and what I saw in the news in Canada was true. Canada has some stricter regulations around news than the United States does. We don't look at Fox as news here from Canada. We see it as propaganda, which is pretty much what it is. But then if people are taking it in and actually mistaking it or misinterpreting it to be factual news, that is how there's almost a hijacking of the brain. Critical thinking is not at play when people are just consuming that kind of media, and it's kind of terrifying. And it makes me think, what can we do? I mean, you're teaching at a university, you're helping young people and any students to develop critical thinking skills, to think critically. What the heck can we do for folks who are not going to enroll at your university? And I apologize because I didn't bring this question to you beforehand, but do you have any ideas?
No, it's not necessary. I mean, most of the time people don't give me questions, so it was nice of you, but just go with it.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Oh, that I wonder what we can do now, because it's kind of like the ball is rolling down the hill. What can we do now to try and stop it or decrease the impact that it will have?
That's a very good question, and in the universities are not areas of free inquiry the way they were 6 or 8 months ago, because again, the Trump administration has been very systematic in the way they target independent sources of information and investigation. And so the universities have been come under a tremendous assault. Like Harvard University has been targeted using the idea that they are discriminating by implementing DEI, and that they're anti-Semitic, or they are allowing anti-Semitism because of the protests over the Gaza war. And so Harvard has been kind of trying to fight back, but other universities are kind of changing, like shutting down their DEI programs. And like the University of Virginia just signed an agreement with the Trump administration, which kind of puts it under a kind of receivership. And so in the universities, and at my university, because I'm in Texas, which is a very conservative state, one of my colleagues was fired because she was teaching a children's lit class, although the people in the class are adults. But I think one of the books had a transgender character, and so the class discussion was issues related to transgender people, and one of the students A, recorded it, and B, said that it violated a Donald Trump executive order. And she took her complaint to the upper administration, and so my colleague was fired. And so even though you want to teach the full spectrum of knowledge, you have to be careful. So there's that. There's that. But I mean, going back to what can we do? I think she has a lawyer, and I think she's probably got a good case that she was unjustly fired. And there are organizations that are, free speech organizations that are bringing cases. And like I said, Harvard is trying to defend itself. And so there's that, the legal side, the organizational side. But in terms of like what an ordinary person could do, one of the things that's happening is that information is being made this incredibly scarce resource, and sources of information are targeted for attack. Like, for instance, Ontario in Canada, the premier of Ontario, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, Doug Ford. Mm-hmm.
Doug Ford, he ran an ad where Ronald Reagan is saying that tariffs, do damage to the economy, to the country that levies them. And Trump cut off all negotiation with Canada. And even though like the quotation from Reagan was a factual, it was his actual words. Yeah. Nevertheless, the fact that it went against the message that Trump wanted, it didn't matter whether it was factual or not. And so I say that by way of saying, therefore, what an ordinary person can do is try to hunt down factual information. It seems like kind of a stupid piece of advice, but it's so hard. And the other thing to do is therefore support independent sources, independent media sources that base their reporting on facts. And people often say, well, people don't really have time to do this, but never consume only one source of news, even if it is fact-based, because even the fact-based ones have their bias. And the other thing is to try to call out when possible obvious distortions. Like, you can watch Fox News for an hour and there'll be real factual information, but then there'll be 6 or 7 distortions or outright lies. So
yeah,
I mean, I don't know if that's. I think if everybody did that, actually, it would be very powerful.
Oh yeah, and I want to give a big shout out to Mississippi Free Press. We love their work, and we support them here. My husband and I from Canada. They do such a fantastic job. The Mississippi Free Press. So I do then have a question. So I love your TikTok, and I know you're just getting started, so you don't have too many things posted on there yet. But one that was especially interesting to me, you talked about meaning reassignment and the U.S. being caught up in a meaning reassignment machine. And I feel like that does tie in with kind of the the misinformation or the distortions that some of the things we're referring to in this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about that, meaning reassignment?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like the reassignment of the meaning of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, if people who've traced the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion make the argument that, the 14th Amendment was a diversity, equity, and inclusion measure because it was intended to include the former slaves under the protection of the laws. Same for the 15th Amendment, same for the Civil Rights Act of 64, same for rules against sexual harassment in the workplace. Because, for instance, with sexual harassment, these practices that people thought were no big deal, like making crude jokes and crude come-ons and so on, they were forced to see that, in fact, you were doing damage to somebody else, and so like that was a way of like including the person as an equal, and diversifying the perspectives within the organization. Because as you were saying before, it's been found in lots of research that diverse perspective in an organization can make the organization more successful because it's able to, for instance, if you're selling to a diverse group of people, it helps to be able to say, well, over here, they don't like that kind of sauce. They want this kind of sauce. And so it helps. Or in police departments, I give an example in the book of in San Francisco, there's an organization called Chinese for Affirmative Action. And in the 70s and 80s, and they campaigned for, hiring of more Asian Americans in various fields, including in the police department, which reduced the amount of time needed to respond to crimes in like, for instance, Chinatown, where the English-speaking cops couldn't do as good a job.
Right.
And so that's an example of like, how diversity and equity and inclusion is a good thing. And so the meaning reassignment is just changing into this synonym for discrimination, racial discrimination. And so all that stuff gets like hidden or gets covered up. All the good that was done by diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. One last little footnote on it. It's true that sometimes people can go too far, like in diversity training, and I've sat on like kind of diversity committees, rolling my eyes. I mean, like with a nice, but but I never thought of it as this kind of destructive thing. I just thought of it as kind of ineffective, but I never saw it as this discrimination, something destructive, which is like what the message is now. So that's an example of reassigning the meaning in such a way as to kind of, and weaponizing it in such a way as to destroy whole swaths of civil rights measures that have been benefiting people for decades.
Yes. Wow. Pardon me. You're giving me so much to think about. I have another question for you. For listeners who might be unfamiliar with your thesis, what would you say is one key myth about affirmative action that your research forces us to reconsider? So one key myth about affirmative action.
A key myth is that affirmative action benefits unqualified people and punishes meritorious people. And I'm hoping that my book will dispel this idea, because again, it was only allowed to be considered as a plus factor. You had to have lots of other things going for you before you were, admitted to a university or hired for a job, and so it was never like the deciding factor in an admission or a hiring. And another thing is that affirmative action only benefits Black or Latino people, but in fact, it benefited lots of, for instance, white women. It benefited lots of Asian people. That's why you had Chinese for affirmative action, because they wanted in on it, because it was a way to, get Chinese people hired in various jobs from which they had been excluded. And, there's small business variations on affirmative action that benefit people of all races. And there are even like examples of affirmative action where like white men benefit because like I think at the University of Texas at Austin, I interviewed an executive there, and he said that, like in the nursing school, a man who applies to nursing school, which like has a overwhelming female cohort, he might have an edge getting into nursing school that way. And then people often point out that there are legacy admissions, like people like Jared Kushner got into Harvard as either legacy or his father like had so much money to give to Harvard. Right. There are lots of people like that who kind of fly under the radar and they never are seen as unqualified because they have something in my book I call it transcendental merit, where like your merit is completely divorced from your history. It's just like it's like something with this like glow that you have that makes you above criticism.
Now, your work emphasizes how historic alliances among racial groups or between racial justice movements and labor or economic justice movements were fractured. So it emphasizes how historic alliances were fractured. Are you optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding new kinds of coalitions, or what might they look like in the current moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a little bit optimistic. Now, the alliances, for instance, between Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, formed because they were seen as mutually beneficial to kind of have this mutual support system to get affirmative action to open doors for people, get small business loans to jumpstart like a neighborhood economy and so on. But one of the things that the leaders of the anti-civil rights movement was they really targeted certain people, certain groups to split them off. And for instance, Bloom, he in his most recent case, he really looked for Asian plaintiffs, and he went out recruiting Asian plaintiffs. And this is like part of a long conservative tradition of saying, well, look at this. This is a super minority. They don't need any extra help. And so, they're being discriminated against by these benefits that go to Black people. And he also said even white people are getting an edge over Asian Americans that's unfair. And he pointed to test scores and so on. But one of the research and one of the friend of the court briefs that was submitted during that students for fair admissions versus Harvard and students for fair admissions versus University of North Carolina, those two cases that struck down affirmative action, one of the friend of the court briefs pointed out that one of the reasons why you might have higher test scores and so on is that a lot of the and I hate to generalize. I start to cringe when I start to generalize, but I'm just I'm summarizing this research. Okay, so one of the reasons that they might have higher test scores and so on is because they tended to come from families where both parents were college graduates, or they came from cultures that were very test centric, and so therefore again the history is missing. The history, and so the difference between, and again, this is just an example, a Black kid who comes from a school that's maybe not tip top and maybe both parents didn't go to college, is not taken into account because you're colorblind and all you're looking at is the test scores. And the other thing that people point out who defend affirmative action is, even though the test score over here might be higher, it's not always higher, but there's a stereotype that it's the Black kid's going to have the lowest test score. And the other part of it is that everybody gets admitted is actually qualified because Harvard, so many people applied at Harvard that you could reject like, two or three or four class cohorts who are all qualified. and so you have to choose. And you can't, and if you just choose on test scores, why do you bother to have an admissions process? So it's anyway. So, but my hope in terms of forming coalitions is, and I hate to put it this way, but a lot of people are reforming coalitions. A lot of people who gave Trump the benefit of the doubt, or some communities, members of whom gave Trump the benefit of the doubt, are really suffering now. Like he got a significant bump in Latino votes, but like Latinos are being targeted in this kind of very vicious way. And yes, whether or not they're citizens, sometimes, or grabbed off the street and thrown into jail and so on. So, like maybe some of those people will reconsider depending on how the election goes. And then another thing that's kind of hopeful is the No Kings March. Although it's not as diverse as you would hope it, but it's huge. And I think it'll, over time, as it becomes more successful, it'll become more diverse.
Yeah, boy, we were sure cheering everyone on from Canada, everyone who was participating in the No Kings March. Now, of course, we do have a king being in Canada, but we printed off flyers instead that said "No Tyrants," and we drove around with those flyers posted on the windows of our car here in British Columbia.
King Charles is not having anybody arrested on the street, right?
Exactly. One of the TikToks that I also found interesting that you did was on the politics of envy, and I'm thinking of this book, The Anti-Civil Rights Movement. It was a great book. It is so educational, and I was amazed. I feel like if I was writing that book, I would be so angry, and my anger is what would come out. I don't feel that's what came out for you. But then it was making me think, it feels like there is so much hatred aimed towards people of color. And then I watched your TikTok about the politics of envy, and it made me just maybe look at things a little bit differently. Do you feel comfortable talking about that at all, the politics of envy?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Politics of envy. Yeah, so my point is, and I always try to find a way to not just say, these people are evil or something like that. I always try to find a way like, okay, why did they want to do it? Or what motivates them? And I think, just to give you an example of Trump, his political career, in my opinion, started out in envy for Barack Obama. And there's like not only him, but like a bunch of people who said like, this person could not be a citizen. He must have been born elsewhere. And they demanded that he show his birth certificate. And Trump was very prominent in doing that. And that's how he kind of launched his political career in demanding Obama's birth certificate. And then I asked, okay, why would they question this guy who, his birth was announced in the papers in Hawaii, and he went to Harvard. I think he was president of Harvard Law Review.
Right.
He's incredibly eloquent. He was obviously a brilliant person when you hear him speak. And so why is that? But I remember back in the day in the Rush Limbaugh radio program, another part of this kind of conservative media network, he would say, Obama is doing badly in the presidency because when he was in college, people wrote his papers for him, or when he was in law school, but now nobody's going to write his paper for him. And so there's this presumption that this person was intellectually inferior, in spite of all, in the face of all the evidence to the contrary. And I think, and so therefore there's this envy, like how can this unqualified person, and it goes back to the whole rhetoric against affirmative action, how can this unqualified person be the most powerful person in the world and the person who politically is in the most exalted position? And so I think that's where the envy comes from. Like and Trump is looking at him saying, like, if he could do it, why not me? And so that's part of this politics of envy, which there's Barack Obama as an example, but you could spread it to like anybody who gets in. When my kid didn't get in, like he got into Harvard, my kid got rejected. There must be some kind of rigged game here. And so it's this envy that's rooted in this presumption that Black people or people of color are just not on the same level of merit as a white person who might be your relative or your friend, or might be you yourself. Bloom, when he was recruiting for his organization, said something to the effect that, were you unfairly rejected or from college? And like, how do you know? I mean, when I went to college, I got rejected, but how would I know if it was unfair? But there's this presumption that it's unfair, and if it's unfair, it's not the legacy guy, it's not Jared Kushner who pushed me out. It's a Black kid, or it's a Latino kid, or it's a Native American kid. And so that's in a nutshell, like, I think how the politics of envy works. And it's really changed, it's transformed the country. You think it's like something like kind of envy is not such a big deal, but it's changed the whole country.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, you're right, because it's so envy and resentment are so tied together, and it's almost like they're a set of goggles that we put on, and they cause us to misinterpret everything that we see then through that lens of envy. Well, thank you for that, because that did make me consider things in a different way. I have just another couple questions because we have a few minutes left. These ones are maybe a little more personal. If you could time travel to witness one civil rights milestone firsthand, which moment would you choose and why?
There are a lot, but I think the one that would fascinate me most is to go back and watch Martin Luther King's organization training people who wanted to be civil rights marchers and protesters, because they had to be trained in nonviolence and not to react with the violence they were certainly going to encounter, not to react to that with violence. And he had to separate out the people who he thought could make it and do that, and then the people who he thought, well, no, you better just stay in the office and type up letters or something, because like you can't master this philosophy of nonviolence and live it out. So I'd love to go back and see how that all worked, and like how he interacted with them. He or his deputies interacted with the people they recruited.
Yeah, you did a great TikTok on that. Boy, it was very, very eye-opening. And you went through a list that Martin Luther King actually used, that people had to go through to see whether or not they would be appropriate for the organization and where they could serve or should serve, because not everyone should be out on the front lines, like you say.
That's right.
And that makes me think about the No Kings protest. Millions of people marching, and they were not getting arrested for disturbing the peace. So these were just people leaving their homes and going out to join other people in the community. They hadn't been through this vetting process or anything. It made my heart very happy to know that the people conducted themselves so well in those marches.
That's right. They did get some training, I think. I think some of the organizers did train them and did emphasize, like, don't, throw trash cans or whatever. Because remember, just before the last march, the Republican leaders were going out saying these are all terrorists and they're Hamas sympathizers and so on. And so they did the opposite. They, put on these kind of like animal costumes and danced.
Yes. And nobody threw so much as a sandwich this time around. So that was, it was very well done. This one is similar to that question. Which historical figure, either an ally or an opponent of civil rights, would you most want to debate over dinner?
Well, the people I'd want to debate, I don't think I'm equipped to debate them. But and so the people I'd like to kind of talk to and interview over dinner, maybe Thurgood Marshall, who did so much to And I guess actually somebody I might want to debate now that I think about it is maybe Derek Bell, because Derek Bell is, I started the book out with a little anecdote about him, but he had this thesis of the permanence of racism. And I think there's been a lot of evidence that he could cite recently, but I still think that it's not racism that's permanent. It's like this, what I talk about, this prisoner's dilemma in the book that's permanent. And prisoner's dilemma, and I'm just using this story. So it's from game theory, which is this mathematical discipline, and I'm not a mathematician. But the story behind it is that, or the story they used to illustrate is that two criminals are caught and they're interrogated separately, and each one is pressured to kind of give up the other person in order to get a lighter sentence. But it turns out that if neither one talks, they just can get basically a slap on the wrist. But if both talk, then they will they'll get the heavier. Oh no, I'm sorry. I think if both talk, they'll get the heavier sentence. But the point is that one of them, it makes the most sense to not be silent, because if both are silent, they get the lightest sentence, and so it makes sense to settle out your partner. And the game theorists call this defecting. And so I think what's really permanent is this prisoner's dilemma, because people, when they're under pressure, they tend to defect from alliances and they tend to defect from coalitions. And so that's what's permanent. And I don't know what the solution is, because sometimes you defect into racism, or sometimes you might defect into, some kind of envy and resentment that does a lot of damage to other people. Like now, now some people are saying, like, these deportations to, super prisons and to war zones, it's going too far. But a lot of people were saying, that we have to get crime under control, and like this emphasis on crime as being out of control was one of the ways that Trump got elected. And so you kind of defect from the idea that, well, shouldn't everybody have due process, and shouldn't we get all the facts? Going back to the information thing, shouldn't we get all the facts about what the actual crime rate is? Like, he's sending troops to places where crime has actually been going down, and he's saying Seattle is a war zone, or Portland is a war zone, when it's obviously not. And so so people defect from even the truth about what's in front of their eyes sometimes, based on this kind of prisoner's dilemma situation.
Wow. Yeah. It seems that he is following the dictator's playbook. The things that he's doing, they may be new to America, the United States of America, but they are not new around the world, because we see that other dictators who have come to power have tried these exact and done these things. So of course, that's why he's doing them, because he wants to hold on to that power. But that is a conversation for another day. Oh, I've enjoyed our conversation.
Let me just make a little footnote real quick.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I messed up my story of the Christmas loan. The reason that there's pressure on them is that if one person confesses and the other doesn't, the person who doesn't confess gets a very heavy sentence. If they both confess, then they get a medium sentence, and if both keep their mouth shut, they get a light sentence. And so therefore, that's why it makes the most sense logically to confess or defect from your partner. I'm sorry, I messed up the story. But anyway, the principle is that therefore people defect from coalitions.
Yes, and as you say that, I'm remembering it. You do discuss that in the book at the beginning of your book. You have a lot of information in it. It's wonderful, the anti-civil rights movement. So I will definitely have a link for people so that they can buy that book. I'd love as many people to read it as possible. And people can also follow you on TikTok. You're on there are you on there as Mike Steve Collins or Michael Steve Collins?
I think it's Mike Steve Collins.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere else that people can find you or should find you?
That's pretty much it, except for my publications. But And I haven't put one up lately because I've been so busy with other things. But I'm going to try to put up a new one.
Well,
thanks for
so much.
promoting it. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and it was great to hear from somebody in Canada. And you give me some news from Canada. I appreciate it.
Yes, thanks again. Mike Steve Collins was my guest today. Please do yourself a favor and read his book. It's just a wonderful book. And join me again sometime soon on Sex and Power. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Sex, power.